Perseus. Do you remember coming face to face with Perseus in Vietnam?
EKG is spiking.
I need you to relax and focus, Bell. Your helicopter crashed. You made your way through the jungle, alone. You found a bunker.
All right, welcome back. So we are getting into Unit 12, which is the Cold War. Definitely one of the most interesting units of all. But to be fair, a lot of times the school curriculum for all of these units leaves out some of the most fascinating and interesting stuff. So in the background, what you're seeing is gameplay, me playing Call of Duty, Black Ops, Cold War. And again, the game's pretty good. I'm sure most of you have either played it or watched some of your friends play at least one of the many different Call of Duties, and I'm sure everybody has their favorite. The cool thing about this one is it ties into the original Black Ops, which focuses on a lot of mind control, conspiracy theories and stuff like that. The reality is during the Cold War, the CIA was doing all of these crazy projects. And again, it's not in the curriculum, but it's something you may want to look into yourself. Something like Project MK Ultra, Project Stargate. There's many others that you can look into, which are fascinating. I tend to go over some of those with my students in class, but again, because this is a remediation style video, we don't have time for that. But basically, I'm using the gameplay because the Vietnam War occurs during the Cold War. And the overarching theme is that we're trying to stop the spread of communism. This is referred to as containment of communism. So we have the Korean War and the Vietnam War. Both of these are very similar in what's happening. The North, whether it be North Vietnam or North Korea, they are communist, and they are trying to spread communism by force to South Korea and South Vietnam. And they're getting assistance from the Soviet Union and China in different ways, whether it's, weapons, intelligence, and things like that. So I chose to replay one of these missions that's occurring in Vietnam, and it's all about a secret bunker where the Vietnamese are receiving assistance from the Soviets. And again, this is not a true story, but that kind of thing did happen during the Cold War. And we end up doing some similar things. For example, when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in the 1980s, we help the people in Afghanistan to resist against the Soviet Union. And obviously, we are helping the South Vietnamese and the South Koreans resist against communism. Okay, so when it comes to the Cold War, the first thing we have to understand is after World War II, Germany's the main bad guy, so to speak, as well as Japan. And what happens is the Allies divide up Germany and occupy those sections in order to make sure that Nazism doesn't rise again and to help people in need, those type of things. So Germany is partitioned into East and West Germany, and so was Berlin, the capital city. And as you can see the little arrow down at the bottom, so for the SOL, CSAs, benchmarks, etc., they're going to focus on East versus West. So if you look at the little arrow, you can see the blue to the west, which represents democracy, and the red to the east, which represents communism. And that's because the way that Germany is divided, as well as East Berlin and West Berlin. So in the West, it's the democratic nations, and in the East, it's the Soviet Union, which is communist. So you can see here this map. Great Britain, France, and the United States divide up West Germany, and they're all democratic. Over to the east, you have just the Soviet Union, which is communist. So again, that's how Germany is divided up. And again, occupation, what that means is the people that are living there are being assisted by those that are occupying them. So you can see here, I've zoomed in. Berlin was the capital of Germany, but it's also divided into East and West. But remember, Berlin is in East Germany, so it's surrounded by communism. So the East is communist due to the Soviet occupation. The West is democratic due to French, British, and American control. So this is a map showing the three sectors of West Berlin are eventually divided by the Berlin Wall. The reason that East Germany, or the Soviets, surround West Berlin by a wall is because they're trying to stop those under Soviet communism from escaping to freedom in the West. Now, we all know America has some problems, but there really aren't people trying to escape from America because you're free. If you don't like something about the country where we're living, you can easily leave, and that's something we forget. Under communism, they're not allowed to leave. They're basically trapped there, whether they like or agree with communism or not. So next, Japan was occupied by American forces, but they quickly resumed self-governance under a democratic government system. Japan remains a strong ally with the United States today. The Marshall Plan gave financial assistance to Europe, which lay in ruins after World War II. A lot of people ask, well, why would we do that? Well, we need allies, and we need them for economic purposes to buy our goods, and it's also jobs for Americans. The United Nations was formed to prevent future global wars. The United States became one of the 5 nations on the Security Council. So if you remember, the League of Nations didn't fly because the senators were afraid of America having to follow orders from foreign countries. Well, with us being on the Security Council, we didn't have to worry about that. So the United Nations becomes a thing. Again, their main goal is to prevent future wars like World War II. All right, so next up we have the origins of the Cold War. So one thing you should focus on is that the Cold War lasted from the end of World War II until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now down at the bottom, big differences here, and I've tried to color code them. So first off, the boring part, we have economics. Remember, economics is jobs, trade, and money. The United States is generally a free market economy. People choose their jobs. Business is not completely controlled by the government, but sometimes the government regulates things like the stock market in order to make things more fair. However, in the Soviet Union, communist economy, the government provides jobs and things that people need, like housing. Now, switching over to the right, under politics, the United States has democracy. People vote for leaders that run the country. The Soviet Union has a totalitarianism type of government where they have one party, the Communist Party, and they select a dictator that leads the entire nation. So people have no say in the matter at all. So one of the main things that identifies the Cold War was this constant fear of nuclear war. So I'm going to skip down to the purple area at the bottom. In the 1950s, the Soviet Union matched the United States in nuclear weaponry. So for a while, the United States was the only country with nukes. But because of spying, because of the Rosenbergs, who are a husband and wife spy duo, they give nuclear secrets. And what President Eisenhower does is he adopts a policy of massive retaliation to deter any nuclear strike by the Soviet Union. Now, obviously, this works because we're well beyond the Cold War and we're still here. To be fair, nuclear weapons have never been used again since they were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So jumping back up to the middle, America feared the spread and domination of communism. However, when China became communist, they were rivals with the Soviet Union. So we were afraid that all the communist countries were going to band together and just create this huge empire, but that's not really what happened. United States President Nixon, he exploited their rivalry in the 1970s. So we'll talk more about that later. So ultimately what happens is we have these two alliances. So for the United States, we join what's called NATO. After the Berlin airlift, which is because the Soviet Union blocked West Berlin, so we could not have convoys going through East Germany to get to West Berlin. So we had to actually use airplanes to drop in supplies like food and such. So the US and Western European nations formed NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as a defense alliance to prevent a Soviet invasion of Western Europe. In response to this, the Soviet Union and its allies formed what's called the Warsaw Pact. So you can see down at the bottom the maps showing who was aligned with who, and obviously the blank ones, they were just neutral. So one of the key points regarding the Cold War is that the Korean War and the Vietnam War, in particular the Vietnam War, they were not really popular wars. For example, in World War II, the soldiers came back as heroes. We had been attacked and we defeated the enemy, etc. But the Vietnam War, in particular, we didn't view them as a threat. Why were American boys dying thousands of miles away. We had not been invaded by Vietnam, etc. But we're doing this as a humanitarian thing, as well as we don't like communism. That's what it boils down to. It's, again, the containment of communism. JFK, John F. Kennedy, he basically becomes elected as president, and in his inaugural address, he gives two key quotes that are very important. They're both in the purple box right there, and I'm sure you've heard the second one. That's the one I'm going to focus on because in general for these standardized tests, that's what usually pops up, but it's ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. So JFK, President Kennedy, he was assassinated in 1963 in Dallas, Texas, in an event that shook the nation's confidence and began a period of internal strife and divisiveness, especially spurred by divisions over the United States' involvement in Vietnam. But as I've mentioned several times, I love a good conspiracy, but most of them turn out not to be much to them. The Kennedy assassination, however, was filmed. You can actually go and see his assassination, and I warn you before you do, it is very graphic. However, there are many conspiracy theories regarding his assassination, and many of them are kind of ridiculous, but the reality is, it seems pretty much like there's more to the story. So again, I'll leave that door open for you if you're interested to go check that out on your own. But there's lots of great information, but be careful because some of the information is ridiculous. So as I just mentioned a few minutes ago, unlike veterans of World War II who returned to a grateful and supportive nation, Vietnam veterans returned to face indifference or sometimes hostility. I remember hearing about stories where Vietnam veterans were spit on by people who opposed the war. But that's kind of crazy if you think about it because many of them were drafted. They didn't choose to go over there and fight. It's something that they were forced to do, against their will. Now, many people did volunteer as well, but many people did not. It was not until several years after the end of the Vietnam War that the wounds of the war began to heal in America, and Vietnam veterans were recognized and honored for their service and sacrifices. If you haven't visited the Vietnam War Memorial in Washington, D.C., otherwise known as The Wall, you really should. It's a very moving experience because there are so many Vietnam veterans still alive, and each time that I've been, there have been people there. It's very sad. So we mentioned the two wars, the Korean War and the Vietnam War. So the Korean War is very overlooked in American history. There's no Call of Duty, Korean War, etc. So the whole purpose of the Korean War, as I mentioned previously, it's about the containment of communism. North Korea has invaded South Korea, and we as the United States are attempting to stop communism from spreading. So eventually, we are able to assist South Korea to resist, and today, South Korea is an ally of ours, and we still have military bases in South Korea. So just like the Korean War, the Vietnam War is kind of the same. North Vietnamese people are trying to install a communist government in South Vietnam by force, so the United States helps South Vietnam to resist. The American military buildup started under President Kennedy, but then intensified under President Johnson, who took over after JFK was assassinated. So again, the containment of communism was put in place to allow communism where it already existed, like the Soviet Union and China, but to prevent it from spreading to other places. The American military repeatedly defeated the North Vietnamese, but it couldn't end the war because we had to fight what's called a limited war, meaning no nukes. If we use nuclear weapons, China and or the Soviets would likely retaliate against us. African Americans and the poor were disproportionately represented on the front lines, and Nixon was elected to get the United States out of the war. So he comes up with this plan called Vietnamization, which was the gradual removal of U.S. troops and replace them with South Vietnamese troops, but ultimately that failed. Additionally, while negotiating an end to the Vietnam War, President Nixon, along with his Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, instituted the Cold War policy of détente. So that's something you might want to make a note of or just keep in the back of your head in case you see that on one of these standardized tests. This ultimately leads to Nixon visiting China, which was a huge deal, and he formally recognizes the communist-controlled People's Republic of China. Now you might say, what do you mean recognize them? That's literally where the United States as a country we say, okay, we recognize that you are a sovereign nation, and that's a big deal. And again, in other cases, if you did not do that, that means that there's bad vibes going on between you. You might not trade with each other, etc. Obviously, our trade with China is very important as we are inundated with Chinese products here in America. But due to the relaxation of the tensions between the United States and China, the Soviets also sought to improve relations. So President Nixon, while he was forced out of office because of the Watergate scandal, Nixon has been viewed as this terrible president, and maybe in some ways he might be, but the way that he handled China and the Soviet Union is the one good thing that he did, if you can't view anything else in a positive light. Okay, so I'm not going to lie, this next part is going to be tough because it's a fascinating situation and the closest we've ever been to World War III. So what happens is we find out that there are Soviet missiles in Cuba. Fidel Castro leads a communist revolution in Cuba, and many of the pro-democracy Cubans, they flee to the United States. The CIA, through Operation Mongoose, trains them to fight, which leads to the Bay of Pigs invasion, which fails. The Soviet Union stationed nuclear missiles in Cuba, which is only 90 miles away from the United States. JFK orders a naval blockade of Cuba as the Soviet ships are approaching. While the United States and Soviet militaries each believed they could win a nuclear war, JFK and Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev secretly negotiated for peace. Ultimately, the Soviets removed the missiles from Cuba, and a month later, the United States quietly removed missiles from Turkey. So, how did the Cold War affect us? The fear of communism and the threat of nuclear war affected American life throughout the Cold War. During the 50s and 60s, school children regularly held nuclear attack drills. Americans were urged to build bomb shelters at their homes. Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were convicted of giving nuclear secrets to the Soviets via spying, and they were executed. Then we have McCarthyism. Senator Joseph McCarthy begins accusing his rivals of communism. Now that sounds crazy, like who cares? But back then that was like being accused of being a rapist or a pedophile. That's how serious it was. The Cold War made foreign policy a major issue in every election during this period. And then the big star, Hampton Roads in Northern Virginia, benefited from the Cold War military buildup due to several large military bases in both areas. So that's something you probably are going to see on any type of standardized test. So internal problems ultimately lead to the demise of the Soviet Union. Rising nationalism in Soviet republics. So what that is remember, the Soviet Union has all these separate areas like the Ukraine, Belarus, etc. And nationalism is where they are being proud of who they are, for example, like the Ukraine. Additionally, the Soviet is spending more and more money, and remember, they don't have the economy that the United States does, meaning they don't have the money. Economic inefficiency of communism. So again, the whole point of communism is supposed to be that everybody's equal and has everything that they need. It's not necessarily designed to be competing with other countries over power. It's really supposed to be for fairness. But again, I've said before, communism in the way that it's actually practiced is not the reality of what it's supposed to be, at least in terms of the Soviet Union. American President Ronald Reagan played a very big role in the fall of the Soviet Union. First and foremost, he instituted a massive military buildup. The Soviet Union's economy is not made to keep up with the American economy because, again, our country is all about capitalism. So again, that's a big disadvantage for the Soviets. Number two, Reagan is famous for supporting what's called SDI, or Strategy Defense Initiative. The media called it Star Wars. What this was, it was a plan to be able to shoot missiles out of the sky. Reagan also challenged the moral legitimacy of the Soviet Union with strong rhetoric, including the Berlin Wall speech, which is very famous. And last, President Reagan and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to terms of arms reductions in the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. This is called START. Okay, so I'll leave you here with one last clip from Call of Duty Black Ops Cold War. And just to remind you, the Cold War is a very interesting topic, and again, a lot of it's stuff that's not within the curriculum. So please, if you've heard anything interesting or if you just want to know more, go and look up some of these things for yourself. Next unit's going to be all about the civil rights movement, which is very fascinating. We're going to learn about Martin Luther King, who was also assassinated during this time period, like JFK, and just all the things that happened in order to get rid of the Jim Crow laws, etc. So look forward to seeing you in the new video, and thank you so much.